Hey everyone, synths here, and man, that last video went a little bit harder than I had expected. I'll be honest. Lots of comments, lots of views, so that's pretty cool. But I didn't really have a follow-up video ready because I'm not the sort of person that really plans ahead, so I don't have anything to feed the algorithm to ride the wave. I did think of some cool titles, like for instance, old analog synthesizers are for boomers, or maybe something like Eurorack is for people with too much money. But, it's not about being controversial. The statement I wanted to make is more infomercial, trying to inform people about certain aspects of using certain types of gear. That was more the vibe I was going for. But since we have a little wave going here, I figured, well, let's do a little follow-up. And what better way to follow up any video than a react to the comments type video? So let's dive right in with this comment from your mom is well, it's sort of rude. Let's not do it that way. Let's just go into this general conception of many of the comments. I think that's more constructive and more interesting. So let's break it up into a few categories. A lot of comments seem to agree with the general statement that I made, which is kind of surprising because I was expecting a fair bit of backlash. So nice. Some people actually understood the point I was trying to make, and that's excellent. So we're just going to group those aside. Cool. Let's talk a little bit about another fairly big category. That's the people who own digital synthesizers and that might say, well, I'm not going to sell my insert synthesizer here. And I would never, ever, ever recommend you to sell your gear or do away with something you enjoy using. I would even go as far as to say that in general on my channel I rarely advise anything, aside from my cheap music production video where I do actually give broad advice. But even then I try to stay away from granular advice. I rather show the advantages and disadvantages and you can see whether or not it fits your use case. So if certain old gear works well for you or your use case, by all means keep using it. Don't sell it because I say it's kind of stupid. Who am I to speak? I have a D50, I have a JV880 and a JV1080 down here. All very antiquated digital synthesizers, which are arguably not all that useful anymore. But they are all classics in a certain regard. That's where I found the appeal. Which nicely leads into the third category of people who say, well, I've always wanted one of these, and now I have the ability to buy something like this. And if you have enough expendable budget and you're trying to live your teenage dreams, that's awesome. I would definitely say go for it. This is one of them. Not specifically a D50, but I've always seen synthesizers in my youth and I was always like, oh, I want one of those. And I used to have one of those Casio all-in-one keyboards for quite a long time, but I've always wanted one of those black boxes with the professional looking things. And well, this is one of those things where I look at it and I go, yeah, that's my childhood dream that I wanted to own. So if that's your goal, your thing you're trying to achieve by buying an old digital synthesizer, it may very well be worth it. There's a fair risk you'll be disappointed by actually using one of these. But well, that's the risk with any gear, huge ADXA. So yeah, that's a fairly big category as well. If you're just in it for the nostalgia, that's totally fine. There's also a very big group that said, well, buying hardware is an investment. I generally don't think of musical instruments as an investment, and that's due to a few factors. First off, a lot of gear will not become very valuable unless you're willing to wait a very long time. Like for instance, the JDXA is just dropping in value, D50s are fairly stable, JV1080s are about as worthless as they were always. When the 80s came, there was actually a big period of time where the older analog synthesizers became virtually worthless as well. And that might happen with these things as well at some point. if Roland actually makes a good follow-up to this synthesizer, there will be no point in buying this synthesizer. Doesn't even have to be Roland, really. If anyone is like, well, I'm going to make a linear synth, there's a fair chance it will be better than this. And there's a fair chance this gear will not be worth anything at the end of the day. Or it might die, which is a fair chance. And one of these things that loses a fair bit of value. Like I said, not easy to repair. It's not easy to get the parts. It's not easy to find a technician that is into maintaining this stuff. Which kind of leads into the other point which I have seen. And that's people saying, well, if you're actually somewhat skilled, you can do maintenance yourself. And that's also part of the reason why I didn't want to talk about analog synthesizers too much, because I guess with analog synthesizers you have the advantage that most of the components are very generic, right? You can still buy capacitors or resistors or certain type of amps and stuff. It's all still out there. The components are still for sale, although you will have to deal with more modern components with smaller tolerances, which might change the characteristics of the instrument. If that's a meaningful difference, I beg to differ, but it's still something to keep in mind. Now, these synthesizers still have a part of that, in that they still use fairly old school, bigger generic components. Although they also use EEPROMs and stuff which need to be programmed, and if those die, you are not going to be able to get the software running on them or the files on them to restore it. Maybe with a D50 because it's pretty popular, but it's a risk. Even more so with this thing. This thing runs entirely off microelectronics, and basically anything with surface-mounted components. Yeah, it's just a mess to get it repaired, really. It's generally just not worth it financially. So buying instruments just as an investment, I think it's also the wrong mind frame, right? Instruments should be bought because you play them. And if you can sell them off at roughly the value you bought them, that's a nice pro. But it shouldn't be the big argument like, yeah, but if I buy this, I can sell it later with a profit. Who cares? Just buy it to use it and have fun, and later on you can sell it on. And you might make a buck, or you may not. Just don't rely on it being an investment, especially with all digital synthesizers. If you want to do that thing, buy old analog synthesizers, which I kind of left out of the video with a reason. I guess that ties into the next topic. There's always that debate with synthesizers, analog versus digital, that sort of thing. And like I said in the previous point, I would say analog in general is easier to maintain, or well, no, it's not easier to maintain. It's easier to get parts and easier to find technicians who can maintain it than with these things. Because the way they are built and the kind of components they use, this stuff is in general harder to replace than analog gear. You also run into that thing where there is sound differences, which is a point I've seen quite a bit. Now, I'm a big believer that, especially in older gear, the tolerances between instruments is actually already fairly big, right? The quality control of these units is good, but there's still always a few percentage difference between every unit. That's just how things work. And that means that if I have my D50 and someone else's D50 and we record the exact same thing, there will probably be a little bit of a difference just in the noise output levels, etc., etc. Tolerances play a part. Which also means that if you're going to capture this digitally, you are kind of creating a more general instrument, which is a amalgamation of all the different variations of an instrument, unless you want to build in all those tolerances and stuff. But I think many of the plugin makers just kind of have a randomization thing going on. It just kind of varies stuff a little bit, and that's about it. So the argument that was being made is that hardware units sound different than software units. And there was actually one very clever comment which said, well, that also has to do with the way processing works, right? With the floating bit processing and more accurate stuff we have these days, you just get different values than in the old ways where more things would be rounded off and all that sort of stuff. And I'm fairly sure that's true. But I do wonder how much of a difference it makes once you start to encapsulate the instruments into a mix. Maybe if you A/B it, a DX7 versus a software DX7, you might be able to spot differences. May very well be. I don't have a DX7, so I can't test it, but I'm sure some people have done it. DX7 versus Dext or the Arturia DX7 or something like that. And I'm fairly sure that at least I would not be able to notice the difference in a mix. And I think with me, most people won't be listening to music thinking, well, I do feel like the resonance response around 5 kilohertz isn't quite right for a real DX7, so this is probably a VST, so I better go out there and burn all my CDs because this band is now officially unlistenable. That's just not how people listen to music, right? No one cares whether or not I use a analog digital hybrid synthesizer or a linear synthesizer or I play a guitar. As long as the sound is good and the song is good, really no one cares what it's made on other than you as the person making it. Maybe a really small niche group of people that are really fanatically into things having to be made on original hardware. It's not as important as people think. And I highly doubt there will be anyone saying, well, you didn't use an original 1960s Mini Moog, so now your entire song is rubbish. Right? It's not how it works. So I think the argument of differences is, yes, there may very well be differences, but I don't think the differences are big enough to justify spending 3-4 times as much money on the original hardware, which may very well fail versus just using a digital alternative. Which handily leads me into the point of people saying, well, I have a X and there is no digital alternative. Yeah, that happens. And the answer is quite simple. Use your hardware. Again, I'm not trying to say you shouldn't use hardware. I'm not going to say you are not allowed to buy hardware. I'm just saying you probably shouldn't buy hardware. Because in most cases, it's neither a good investment nor very easy to use, nor superior to software alternatives. And I think a lot of the instruments, hardware, older hardware synthesizers can be, well, it's not exactly emulated, but you can get close enough to the real deal. Now, if you very specifically want to use certain presets from a synthesizer, or you have been using that for a long time, I can completely understand you wanting to use that instrument, right? If you have a Triton and you are used to that synthesizer and that sound, and you use that sound in all your tracks, obviously when it dies, you're going to buy a new one if you can. I'm not going to judge you. Once again, that's not the point of this video. It's not about saying you're not allowed to or doing this is bad. It's about just awareness that there's risks involved with buying old synthesizers, and especially rather generic synthesizers like the DX7, D50, JP. There are alternatives. Now, one thing that did get mentioned a few times that is indeed a very tricky topic. It's the topic of software and licensing and availability. And this is indeed very problematic. And I don't have a solution for this. There is software out there that doesn't use online authentication, which means that even if the producer of the software stops making it, you can still download it. It won't be maintained, but you can still download it. You might run into the issue eventually that the operating system you're running can no longer support the software, which is obviously something that won't happen with one of these because you're just dealing with audio and MIDI. So whatever software is running on it will keep running as long as this computer stays the same, which it will. Right, that's a totally fair point. Yeah, if a company like Arturia, for instance, says we are going to stop our V collection or whatever, and they pull the plug, and the authentication server goes down, you will no longer be able to authenticate your products and all your VSTs will stop working. Same goes for the Rodent Cloud or whatever. And that's a fair point to this thing, right? Because even though these things are old, they have been running for 40 years. How many software companies support their software for 40 years? Hard to say, actually. But I'm willing to bet it's not that many companies. So that's a fair point. You might say buying one of these has the advantage of probably having a longer longevity than software alternatives. And I'm not going to say that's explicitly true, but yeah, there is a good chance that a synthesizer, especially if you buy a hardware synthesizer now, which is also why I said old digital synthesizer, not new digital synthesizers, there's a good chance that if you buy an old digital synthesizer now and it lasts you another 20 years, it might actually outlast some of the software available today. Yeah, it could happen. It could also not happen. And that's kind of the gamble. We can't see the future. We can't predict this stuff. Which is sort of... I've actually made a video about this that I never published because I thought the topic was too complex to talk about. But it's one of those things where all regulations need to change in order to prevent this from even being a thing. Right, you would have to make rules where when software goes out of support, there needs to be a transition to open licensing where the public can pick up where the companies have left off. And I'm a big believer that's something that needs to happen at some time, although, well, with capitalism being a thing, I highly doubt it will happen within my lifetime. That's the only reason, or the only way I could see software being maintainable over a similar time frame as hardware. And that's a fair point. If you're really concerned about having access to a specific thing for a very long time, yeah, there might be a reason to say hardware is the way to go. I still think you should go newer hardware rather than old hardware, but yeah, that's a fair point. And I'm not going to be able to defend that point as well. So that's fair enough. Now, one last thing, last point I want to address in this video, because we're already getting a fair bit of runtime, is the point about playing live sets with software. There's still a school of thought where if you want to play something live, you need to use hardware because software doesn't offer the stability that hardware does. I get this, and this has long been the way things are, but even in the guitar world you can see there is a transition being made to more and more even bigger bands playing on software systems these days, and a lot of modern music relies on software running along with the concerts to start with. So I think it's not entirely fair to say that you can't play a live show on software instruments. I think even Jordan Rudess uses Omnisphere in his live shows and stuff like that. So he does have his big workstation synthesizer, but many of the sounds actually don't come from that synthesizer. And that happens more often in live environments with big bands than people might think. I think Epica and some other bands do this as well with their big orchestral libraries. They run it in software and not on the actual hardware. Now you might say they still have the hardware synthesizers. I don't know what the reasoning behind that is, but they probably use a mix of those sounds with the software library, something like that. So I don't think it's impossible to run a live show on software. I think with things like Gig Performer or even lightweight stable tools like Reaper, you can probably get away with it. At the same time, I can totally understand smaller productions not wanting to deal with that sort of stuff. And again, that's a fair point. If you have a workstation synthesizer with all your sounds in there that you need, that's totally going to work for you. And I'm not judging you for that. I would probably not take a 40 or 50-year-old synthesizer on the road saying it's more stable than a modern software solution or a modern digital synthesizer. Again, I think a more modern instrument would be a safer bet than old instruments. And there's guys like Kebu, who run big synthesizer setups with lots of vintage synthesizers, and there's more than once that he has posted that part of his setup has broken down or he needed to do repairs while on a tour. Which, again, with old things can be challenging if you lack the knowledge yourself. So it's not completely an invalid point to say it's not good for live. But yeah, I can see why some people would not want to bother with software in a live environment. Again, totally reasonable. If it works for you, keep doing it. If you're not into that yet, I'm just saying maybe consider that it's not the best option out there. That's really the point of this video that I made. It's not about saying what you can and can't do. You should totally do what you want to do. I just want to warn you from a vantage point, because I went into this music thing thinking as well, if I buy the old hardware, I have the old sounds and I have the old experience and it will be great. Where in reality there's a lot of things that could go wrong, which are less convenient and which are more challenging. Oh, last thing I kind of forgot. Yes, I am aware that there are programmers for these things. I use Patchbase myself for the JV 1080 and the D50. And there's also free software that helps you with programming these things. Does mean that you need to run a computer or an iPad or something to manage that software. And it's yet another link you need to work with. I don't think it's much more of a convenience. And again, buying the hardware controllers is a thing. They are not cheap. And if you're going to spend $1,000 on an instrument, you have to question if it's a smart idea to spend it on something that's 40 years old. That's it for this video. Probably going to get a lot of comments as well, but keep it classy and see you in the next one.